USS Wisconsin was one of the most powerful battleships ever developed. No enemy ship or fortification could survive a direct hit from her powerful main battery of 9 16-inch guns. After a brief but successful service in World War II, she fought again in the Pacific, but this time in Korea, against the invading communist forces. While Wisconsin, known fondly as Big Whiskey by her crew, was decimating enemy positions in Songkin, she was hit for the first time since World War II with a North Korean 155mm artillery shell. Although damage was minimal, and only 3 sailors were lightly injured, Wisconsin unleashed a full salvo of her 16-inch main battery against the small enemy emplacement. The enemy battery and its surroundings were obliterated, resulting in craters full of little more than rubble. USS Wisconsin was an Iowa-class battleship laid down in January 1941 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She was part of the Navy's fast battleship design, the third out of 4 ships of the Iowa class, and the second Navy vessel to bear the name of the 30th American state. The battleship was armed with 9 powerful 16-inch guns, split into 3 turrets, 12 5-inch guns, 20 dual-purpose Mark 12 guns, 80 L-60 guns, and 40 Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons. The main battery of Mark 7 guns had a range of over 20 miles, while the secondary battery could fire at targets up to 10 miles away. Wisconsin's armor was between 9 and 14.5 inches thick, providing excellent protection against enemy land and naval gunfire. Additionally, the battleship was equipped with AN/SPS-49 air search radar, AN/SPS-67 surface search radar, and AN/SPQ-9 gunfire control radar. The Iowa-class battleship was 887 feet long, had a beam of 108 feet, a draft of 37 feet, and a displacement of 57,540 long tons. Wisconsin's advanced propulsion system enabled her to reach over 30 knots, granting her agility and striking power. Wisconsin was launched in December 1943 and commissioned in April 1944 under the orders of Captain Earl E. Stone. After training and trials in the Chesapeake Bay, she departed Norfolk in July 1944, bound for the British West Indies. In September, the battleship crossed the Panama Canal and reported to the Pacific Fleet in October for training exercises in Hawaii. Wisconsin was one step closer to fighting the Japanese. USS Wisconsin reached the Caroline Islands on December 9, 1944, and joined Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet for the American reconquest of the Philippines. A few days later, USS Wisconsin was destroying Japanese facilities at Manila, working with the Third Fleet's Fast Carrier Task Force 38. Thanks to her help, U.S. aircraft softened up enemy defenses at Manila and destroyed over 270 Japanese fighters and 27 vessels, establishing air supremacy in the region. Task Force 38 saw this winning streak cut short on December 18th, when it was hit by Typhoon Cobra. This tropical cyclone took the lives of over 790 sailors, sinking 3 destroyers and a dozen aircraft, while severely damaging 9 warships. Wisconsin survived the weather's wrath without a scratch, leaving her able to unload her arsenal against the Japanese during operations in Luzon and Formosa, where she provided anti-aircraft support to Task Force 38. These operations lasted the first weeks of January 1945 and resulted in the loss of more than 40 Japanese ships and dozens of facilities, decimating Japanese influence in the Pacific. Wisconsin was assigned to the Fifth Fleet in February when Admiral Raymond A. Spruance relieved Admiral Halsey. She approached the shores of Tokyo with Task Force 58 on the 16th and rained hell on the Imperial Japanese troops. Task Force 58 destroyed over 320 aircraft that took to the skies and over 170 stationed on the ground, in addition to hangars and aircraft facilities around the airfield. Immediately after, Wisconsin was dispatched to Iwo Jima to provide direct fire support to the Marines bound to land on Japanese home soil on February 19th. War in the Pacific was about to turn more violent. As the Leathernecks established the beachheads in Iwo Jima, Task Force 58 was again dispatched to Tokyo to strike it and neutralize defenses at Hachino Island. In March 1945, Wisconsin ravaged Kyushu and swiftly eradicated ground targets at Okinawa with her powerful main battery, pounding artillery emplacements and pillboxes where the defenders were firmly dug in. By June, the American forces were ready to invade mainland Japan. Wisconsin kept pounding Japan with her 16-inch guns, removing oil refineries, storage facilities, and construction buildings. Japan was in flames, but the Imperial Army refused to surrender, which led to a last devastating air raid over Tokyo on August 13th, before the launch of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Wisconsin's next task was Operation Magic Carpet. Its objective was to repatriate U.S. servicemen that served in the Pacific Theater. The battleship was placed out of commission after bringing soldiers to the mainland U.S. During her brief career, she earned 5 battle stars fighting the Japanese. Still, Big Whiskey, as she was fondly nicknamed by her sailors, would not lay dormant for a long time. Another conflict was brewing in the Pacific, and Wisconsin was ready to answer the call of duty. In June 1950, a sudden invasion by Communist North Korea shook South Korea, prompting the United States and the United Nations to prepare for war and counter the advancing troops. Amidst General Douglas MacArthur's efforts to recapture the South and stabilize the front, USS Wisconsin was awakened and recommissioned in March 1951. Under the command of Captain Thomas Burroughs, she embarked on her mission, having completed 2 midshipman training courses. Setting course for the Korean Peninsula, Wisconsin arrived, ready to face the challenges ahead. By November 1951, she reached Japan, assuming the role of flagship for Vice Admiral H.M. Martin, commander of the 7th Fleet, and relieving her sister ship, USS New Jersey. Joining Task Force 77, Wisconsin played a vital role in providing gunfire support for the advancing Republic of Korea troops and the 1st Marine Division in the Kaesong-Kosong region. The ship's firepower wreaked havoc on enemy tanks, artillery, and bunkers. Notably, during one operation, surrounded ROK troops from the 1st Corps requested call fire support. Wisconsin responded by launching 3 star shells, illuminating the night sky with a burst of burning material. This display of incandescent light allowed friendly soldiers to repel the enemy attack. The ship repeated this tactic when supporting the 11th ROK forces in Wonsan Harbor, effectively fending off North Korean troops. As operations continued in December, Wisconsin remained committed to assisting UN troops. She targeted trenches, bunkers, command posts, and large enemy concentrations in the Kojo region. Following these engagements, the battleship underwent a brief checkup in Sasebo, Japan. Wisconsin's secondary battery proved invaluable in eliminating small enemy craft and clearing coastal defenses. In late December, she embarked on a special tour over the Korean Peninsula, accompanied by Cardinal Francis Spellman to celebrate Christmas and conduct Catholic Mass for UN servicemen. In January 1952, the battleship received a great honor with the presence of South Korean President Syngman Rhee, who awarded Vice Admiral Martin with the ROK Order of the Military Merit during his visit aboard the ship. Without delay, Wisconsin returned to the fray, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Wisconsin resumed combat operations in late January and continued providing fire support for ROK divisions, Marines, and UN troops near the coast, severely reducing the combat effectiveness of the 15th North Korean Division. In February, Wisconsin was inspected by high-ranking US and ROK military officers before departing to Songjin to fix her main guns on enemy railway transports. On March 15th, Wisconsin was hit for the first time since World War II, while she destroyed a North Korean tunnel and train that left some enemy vehicles and troops trapped inside. It was a lucky hit from a 155mm gun battery that struck the shield of a starboard side 40mm gun mount. The impact lightly wounded 3 sailors and barely scratched the warship. Still, the direct hit was more than enough to provoke the wrath of the USS Wisconsin and her crew. In response, the mighty battleship fixed her 16-inch main battery on the hostile emplacement and unleashed a full salvo, obliterating the artillery piece and everything in the surroundings. Impressed by her disproportionate show of force, USS Duncan, which was nearby, was quick to signal a message to Wisconsin that said, quote, "Temper, temper." In April, Wisconsin was relieved by her sister ship Iowa and returned to the U.S., earning a 6th battle star for her service in Korea. USS Wisconsin was employed as a training ship and received an overhaul in the aftermath of the Korean War. In 1956, she collided at sea with the destroyer USS Eaton, severely damaging both vessels' bows. Wisconsin was repaired with spare parts from the incomplete USS Kentucky and decommissioned in 1986 as part of President Reagan's 600-ship Navy. For the upcoming Gulf War, Wisconsin was modified with more modern equipment. When U.S. and Allied forces stormed Iraq, Wisconsin provided fire support for Allied forces operating close to the Persian Gulf. Almost 50 years after her development, the 16-inch guns still spread terror among the enemy, decimating facilities and hostile troop concentrations. Whiskey became the last battleship in the world to see combat when the Gulf War ended. When the Soviet Union collapsed, USS Wisconsin was retired and converted into a ship museum in Norfolk, Virginia. By late February 1991, two of the most legendary battleships in history, USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin, lay just off the Kuwaiti coast, silent but ready. After years in mothballs, these ships re-emerged at the president's behest, this time as fully modernized war machines, with Tomahawk cruise missiles, advanced radar systems, and even drones now lining their decks. The anxious Iraqi forces watched these World War II veterans bring the beginning of an amphibious invasion right to their shores. With a single command, Missouri unleashed her firepower, reminding everyone that their most powerful asset needed no update. Her massive 16-inch guns, the same that had hammered enemy fortifications at Iwo Jima, roared to life. 2,700-pound shells tore through the air, crashing into Iraqi defenses along the coast. Moments later, Wisconsin joined the assault, her guns adding to the destruction. For the Iraqis watching them from the shore, the sheer force of the assault of the sister ships was overwhelming. What they didn't know was that these 887-foot-long behemoths were just one piece of a much larger, more complex strategy. As the thunderous guns of Missouri and Wisconsin held their attention, elsewhere, unseen and unexpected, the true nature of the coalition's plan was about to unfold. By the late 1980s, despite the Cold War being in its final stages, global tensions remained high. As the United States cemented itself as the dominant global power, tensions simmered all the way in the Middle East, where Iraq's longtime leader, Saddam Hussein, facing crippling debt after years of war with Iran, decided on a bold solution. On August 2, 1990, Hussein's forces invaded Kuwait, rapidly and crushingly overwhelming the small nation and seizing control of its vast oil reserves. The assault gave the dictator immense amounts of leverage over the global economy, setting off international outcry, with the United Nations imposing sanctions only days later. Nonetheless, Saddam still pressed forward. Now, with diplomacy about to exhaust, the world realized intervention was inevitable. Unwilling to let such a vital area of the world fall deep under hostile control, American President George H.W. Bush rallied an immense international effort. The leader assembled a 34-nation military coalition, one of the largest since World War II, with well over 800,000 soldiers from countries like the United Kingdom, France, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, converging to work as one. That very same August, the United States launched Operation Desert Shield, a defensive mission with the ultimate purpose of protecting Saudi Arabia and its vital oil infrastructure from potential Iraqi aggression. With this, coalition forces fortified positions along the Saudi border. This operation bought the coalition critical time to organize its forces and prepare to go on the offensive for their next objective, liberating Kuwait. As Operation Desert Shield unfolded, the UN issued a blunt ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, Resolution 678, authorizing the use of force if Iraq failed to withdraw from occupied Kuwait by January 15, 1991. With the clock now ticking, the coalition prepared for an all-out assault, a rare occurrence for the end of the 20th century. This would be no easy feat. Although Iraq's armored forces were substantial, the multinational group had a clear numerical advantage. Yet, dislodging the invaders through sheer force would likely come with heavy losses. In response, General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of coalition forces, and his team of elite military strategists came up with a unique three-pronged strategy meant to outmaneuver Iraq's defenses through a masterful blend of force and deception. The first prong involved a direct infantry assault, engaging Iraqi forces head-on to pin them down and prevent reinforcement of other positions. The second prong was a daring left-hook flanking maneuver where powerful tanks would sweep across the Kuwaiti and Iraqi deserts, bypassing enemy defenses and striking from the west, severing the invaders' supply lines and encircling their forces. But for the first two prongs to succeed, the third and boldest of them all had to be performed flawlessly. The plan called for a staged amphibious assault on Kuwait's beaches. The elaborate ruse would make the enemy believe the main invasion would surge from the Persian Gulf. Assuming the attack would develop in the water, top brass would send all the Iraqi defenses and all the men and material there, allowing the real assaults from the first two prongs to thunder seamlessly from inland, striking hard from the south and west, slicing through supply lines, ensnaring Iraqi forces, and driving relentlessly toward the capital. In order to sell this important element of their plan, the coalition needed overwhelming naval firepower, and nothing was more convincing than the presence of massive battleships. As fate would have it, the United States Navy had just the right ships for the operation. USS Wisconsin, an Iowa-class battleship, was commissioned in April 1944 and entered the Pacific Theater that fall. For nearly a year, she and her men played a key role in delivering crucial fire support during bombardments of Japanese-held islands, escorting carrier strike groups as they launched air attacks. This was mainly achieved through her primary weapon system, 9 massive 16-inch guns housed in 3 massive turrets, capable of hurling 2,700-pound shells up to 23 miles. The ship also carried an array of 5-inch dual-purpose guns for anti-aircraft and surface-to-surface weapons. Meanwhile, her sister ship, USS Missouri, was commissioned a bit later, in June 1944, and joined the war too late to make much of a difference in the already winning tides of the end-stage Pacific Theater. Beginning in January 1945, Mighty Mo rained artillery support during the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Most importantly, she was the center of one of the most significant moments of the entire war, when on September 2, 1945, her deck was the site of the formal surrender of Japan in Tokyo Bay, marking the end of World War II, and to many, the end of the battleship's golden era. When the Korean War began in 1950, both sisters answered the call once more, hammering North Korean defenses and troop concentrations, targeting supply lines and key infrastructure. With a top speed of 33 knots, these Iowa-class ships could outpace many contemporaries, seamlessly keeping up with fast-moving carrier groups and responding to shifting battle conditions. Yet, despite the Iowa-class ships' continued effectiveness and track record, new technology, spurred by the beginning of the Cold War, rapidly outmatched these once dominant battleships, causing them both to be decommissioned and placed into the mothball fleet in 1955, where they would lie dormant for decades. By the mid-1980s, naval warfare had evolved significantly. Nonetheless, President Ronald Reagan, looking to bolster America's naval power with a blend of traditional strength and cutting-edge technology, launched the ambitious 600-ship Navy plan, a massive initiative to expand the U.S. fleet and reaffirm its maritime dominance. The leader recognized that in a world where Cold War boiling points could tip over at any moment, the massive firepower and imposing presence of the battleships still held a powerful strategic and also symbolic value of American power. With this, all 4 of the available Iowa-class battleships were reactivated. However, to accurately face modern threats, they needed major upgrades. While the battleships retained their iconic guns, their firepower was vastly expanded with the integration of 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles, long-range precision-guided weaponry that could strike targets deep inland. A set of Harpoon anti-ship missiles also bolstered her offensive might. In order to counter modern threats like incoming missiles and aircraft, shipyard workers installed the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, or CWIS, featuring radar-guided guns. Other critical upgrades included improvements to radar, fire control systems, and electronic warfare capabilities. Now, with their modernization ready, the two sister ships were ready to fight side by side once more. As the January 15th deadline approached, the two colossal 887-foot-long American battleships, USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri, appeared menacingly off the Kuwaiti coast. The former had arrived in late August, followed by the latter in November. As Saddam Hussein braced for full-blown war with the coalition, his large forces appeared powerful, both on paper and publicly. But despite being equipped with Soviet and Western-made tanks, aircraft, and missiles, his men were tired and most definitely battle-hardened by a decade of brutal conflict with Iran. On January 15, 1991, President Bush addressed the nation and the entire world by stating, quote, "Saddam has arrogantly rejected all warnings. Instead, he tried to make this a dispute between Iraq and the United States of America. Well, he failed. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area, standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein." It was finally official. A new era of war had begun. The coalition had the most advanced military technology of the time: precision missiles, stealth bombers, and high-tech air power, dominating the battlefield and terrorizing the enemy. Yet, even amidst this cutting-edge warfare, a duo of battleship legends of a bygone era were vital to the success of Operation Desert Storm. The sister ships' last battle had been in Korea, and now, 40 years later, they were thundering into action as if time had never passed. At exactly 1:40 a.m. on January 17, 1991, USS Missouri launched her first Tomahawk missile, sending it streaking into the midnight sky and marking her triumphant return to battle. Moments later, her iconic 16-inch guns opened fire, her first combat bombardment since March 1953. The thunderous roar of her cannons echoed loudly across the desert as they targeted an Iraqi command and control bunker near the Saudi border. While Missouri delivered her blows, USS Wisconsin took on an equally critical role. As the official Tomahawk land attack missile, or TLAM, strike commander for the Persian Gulf, she coordinated the opening missile salvo of the campaign. In those first crucial days, Wisconsin fired a total of 24 Tomahawk missiles, each one aimed at vital targets deep inside Iraq. With this, the ruse was now in motion. On January 29, 1991, the frigate USS Kurtz led USS Missouri northward, her advanced mine-avoidant sonar guiding the massive battleship through treacherous waters. Just days later, on February 3rd, Missouri unleashed another barrage, this time bombarding Iraqi beach defenses, firing a total of 112 rounds. These operations were coordinated by a Marine OV-10 Bronco. The aging model, much like the battleships, defied expectations and proved their worth, despite having been considered relics of an earlier time. In the weeks leading up to the late February invasion, United States top commanders knew how to seize the world's attention to continue with the ruse. The comeback of the sister ships, USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin, with their massive 16-inch guns, became the focal point of global speculation. Front pages around the world buzzed with reports hinting at an impending amphibious assault. Even the New York Times fell under the spell, with one report from February 4th capturing the growing anticipation. Quote, "Powerful guns aboard the battleship Missouri lobbed 2,700-pound shells against Iraqi command bunkers near the Kuwaiti coastline," military command officials said, describing the shore bombardment as a further indication that an American-led amphibious assault on occupied Kuwait might be drawing near. The world was watching, and even the general public had to believe the fake invasion. 2 days later, on February 6th, USS Missouri was relieved in the gunfire support role by her sister ship, USS Wisconsin. That same day, escorted by USS Nicholas, she unleashed her fury, sending 11 shells across 19 miles, obliterating an Iraqi artillery battery in southern Kuwait. The following day, she finally got an opportunity to use one of her greatest technological updates, bringing into the fight the ship's own RQ-2 Pioneer unmanned aerial vehicle, marking the first time a drone had been used in combat to spot targets. Guiding this unmanned eye in the sky, Wisconsin seamlessly hammered a communications compound, raining down 24 shells on Iraqi missile facilities, artillery sites, and electronic warfare positions along the coastline. That same evening, she fired 50 additional rounds in nearby piers, sinking or heavily damaging more than a dozen ships. On February 9th, Wisconsin continued her assault, pounding bunkers and fortified positions while targeting enemy troops near Khafji, lending support to Saudi and Qatari forces that were pushing the enemy forces out of the city. In the days that followed, her sister ship, Missouri, resumed bombardment in the area, unleashing 60 more rounds before they headed to Failaka Island for her next mission the following week. On the way there, the UAVs continued to prove their worth, this time spotting a convoy of trucks resupplying an Iraqi command post. Wisconsin wasted no time leveling 10 buildings and delivering a powerful blow. For days, the two sisters continued to work in tandem, alternating along the coastline, dismantling Iraqi defenses and forcing them to stay pinned to the coast, their combined firepower paving the way for the coalition's next move. On the night of February 23rd, both battleships turned their guns on Failaka Island, with the goal of using their guns to create a diversionary strike to convince Iraqi forces that the amphibious invasion was now imminent. Missouri opened the assault, tearing into Iraqi defenses, lighting up the night with each impact of her Mark 8 armor-piercing shells, each weighing a massive 2,700 pounds, aided by her Pioneer drone, which continued to scout targets for the ship. Below, explosions rocked the coastline, with shells raining down on entrenched Iraqi positions, shaking the dug-in troops and filling the air with chaos and fear. After Missouri finished its devastating assault, Wisconsin followed suit, launching her Pioneer drone to scan for more targets. This time, however, as the drone's low and menacing buzz reverberated over the island, the Iraqis had had enough. Having just witnessed Missouri's brutal barrage, the terrified men began waving makeshift white flags, signaling their desperate attempt to surrender, not to soldiers, but to a machine in the sky. Amused, Wisconsin's drone operators radioed their commanding officer, Captain David Bill III, asking, quote, "Sir, they want to surrender. What should I do with them?" This unbelievable moment became the most defining and remembered moment of the entire Gulf War, and also marked the first time in history an enemy surrendered to an unmanned drone controlled by a ship. The following day, Wisconsin and her crew responded to multiple calls for fire support, blasting entrenched Iraqi troops from their bunkers. After witnessing the destruction unleashed by the sister ships, a Saudi Marine commander couldn't help but remark over the radio, quote, "I wish we had a battleship in our Navy." Yet, as Missouri and Wisconsin continued to hold the line without fault, the Iraqis had one more desperate and dangerous move to play. The next day, USS Missouri edged within 10 miles of the Kuwaiti coast, escorted by USS Jarrett and HMS Gloucester for security. The illusion was still holding, and just before 1 a.m., Mighty Mo shot once again at Iraqi positions, pounding all along the coastline. To make the deception even more convincing, 10 Marine Corps helicopters launched a feint near Ash-Shweba, their engines roaring across the Gulf. This brazen move would not go unnoticed by the enemy, and this time, Iraq would not sit back. At 4:52 a.m., just as the helicopters pulled away, Iraqi forces, still convinced that the invasion was coming from the sea, responded by launching a duo of Silkworm missiles from the shore, aimed directly at Missouri. An A-6 intruder circling above immediately picked up the launch and reported 2 distinct trails streaking through the sky. The first missile, confused by the chaff fired from the flotilla, veered off and crashed harmlessly into the sea, between Missouri and Jarrett. But the second missile wasn't slowing down. Instead, it sped toward Missouri, locked on and closing the distance fast. Detected more than 20 miles out, it was tracking straight for the battleship. In video footage from that day, a chilling call across the ship's comms, quote, "Missile inbound! Shot! Brace for shock! Missile inbound!" With this, all the men aboard Mighty Mo were beginning to fear for their lives. Nearby, HMS Gloucester, one of the ships providing a defense, picked up the incoming missile on the radar. Reacting instantly, the destroyer launched 2 Sea Dart missiles. Once in the sky, they connected with their target, obliterating the Silkworm before it could reach Missouri. This event marked the first successful missile versus missile engagement at sea in combat. Now, with the biggest threat out of the way, an E-2C Hawkeye circling high above quickly coordinated with surveillance assets to pinpoint the launch site. With the location locked in, intruder attack aircraft were dispatched to deliver their payload. No less than a dozen Mark 20 Rockeye cluster bombs rained down on the missile site, wiping out the remaining missile batteries and reducing them to rubble. While the Silkworm threat was no more, only a few hours later, another close call occurred. It was still February 25th, and USS Missouri continued pounding Iraqi targets along the coast, her guns thunderously echoing across the water. The battle seemed endless, but while HMS Gloucester had moved on, Missouri was now accompanied by USS Jarrett, HMS Atherstone, and HMS Exeter. Amid the bombardment, the situation took another dangerous turn when HMS Exeter spotted thick black smoke rising from an oil well that Iraqi forces had set ablaze. The tension on board Missouri escalated as the alert went out. A missile launch seemed imminent. It was only hours since Missouri had narrowly escaped the first missile strike, and now the crew was ordered to brace for impact once again. In an instant, Missouri deployed her chaff countermeasures, hoping to confuse the incoming missile's guidance systems. But what followed was something no one saw coming. The chaff drifted between Missouri and Jarrett, and suddenly, Jarrett's phalanx defense system, set to auto-engage, identified the chaff as a threat. Without warning, the 20mm cannons from Jarrett opened fire, locking onto the chaff cloud and hitting Missouri. The burst of rounds sprayed across the battleship, jolting the crew as friendly fire struck home. In the confusion of this technological blunder, word aboard Mighty Mo spread that a gas attack could be imminent. Sailors scrambled to put on their gas masks, the fear of chemical warfare hanging over every second, adding to the chaos. Yet again, Missouri had narrowly escaped disaster. The damage was superficial, and no one aboard was seriously hurt, but it was a close call, one too many in a single day. After what felt like hours, the tension broke, and the crew, still braced for impact, was finally ordered to stand down. Though they were still instructed to wear protective gear, the all-clear came at last. Over the intercom, the executive officer's voice broke the silence. Quote, "All stations, relax the gas masks. There's no reported gas and no missile activity." Relief washed over the ship. The looming threat of chemical weapons had hovered over every moment of the Gulf War, keeping the crew on edge. But for now, the danger had passed. Bill Genereux, a crew member working on the systems that aimed Missouri's guns, later described the tension of that day while stationed in the battery plotting room. Quote, "This memory is forever embedded in my memory. I was deep inside of an armored World War II battleship. The plotting room is one of a battleship's vital organs, so to speak. It is the brains to the ship's brawn, the 16-inch guns. Without the computer equipment in this space, the ship cannot fight, so it is located deep inside the armored belt, right next to the engine spaces, meant to be safe from shells and torpedoes. Even so, with a missile bearing down on you, and you can do nothing but stand there and take whatever's coming, you have to wonder if this could be the end." As coalition forces continued with the actual ground offensive on February 25th, naval forces along the coast prevented any sort of redeployment. On February 26th, in the heart of the desert, Captain H.R. McMaster led his troop into the Battle of 73 Easting. In a stunning display of precision and speed, a single unit of Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles decimated 44 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles, without suffering a single loss. This decisive inland victory became an iconic moment in what would be known as the 100-Hour War. That same day, Missouri began armistice enforcement operations. Finally, on February 28th, after weeks of relentless coalition advances, Saddam Hussein, facing overwhelming losses and the absolute collapse of his military, accepted the coalition's terms for peace, and President Bush officially called for an end to the hostilities. By then, these sister ships had collectively unleashed more than 1 million pounds of explosives against Iraqi positions. That same day, Wisconsin fired the last naval gunfire support mission of the war, becoming the final battleship in world history to see action. While the coalition suffered the loss of 300 troops, this number was far lower than expected, largely thanks to the successful ruse that kept Iraqi forces pinned to the coast, unable to focus on the true threat deeper inland. On the other side, Iraqi forces paid a heavy price, with an estimated 10,000 fallen troops, and their armored divisions left in ruins. Over 8 months in service to the Persian Gulf, USS Wisconsin logged 348 UAV hours, completed 661 safe helicopter landings, traveled 46,000 nautical miles, and unleashed 319 16-inch shells, 881 5-inch shells, and 5,200 rounds from its Phalanx Sea-Whiz. She also launched 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles. For her part, USS Missouri cleared 15 naval mines, fired 759 16-inch shells, and launched 28 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Though the battleships had proven their worth in Desert Storm, as the Soviet threat collapsed that same year, all remaining battleships were taken out of service. In the end, these sister battleships, veterans of 3 wars spanning nearly 5 decades, received numerous awards for their service. Today, they are preserved as museum ships. Operation Praying Mantis, the ruthless U.S. Navy response to the mining of USS Samuel B. Roberts by Iranian ships, had begun on April 18, 1988. The first lights of dawn slowly illuminated the Persian Gulf when Vietnam War-era Belknap-class destroyer USS Wainwright surged forward to carry on with her mission. The destroyer was the vanguard of the retaliation operation. Guided by the latest intelligence, Wainwright's targeting systems locked onto the Sasan oil platform. Coordinating with other ships, Wainwright's missiles rocked the platform, engulfing it in an inferno of fire and smoke. As plumes reached the sky, Wainwright swiftly changed course, ready for the next target, the Siri oil platform. Her crew unleashed a barrage that led to more devastation. Victorious, the destroyer and her crew made way for their next objective when the unexpected occurred. The small Iranian Kaman-class fast attack craft Joshan decided to challenge her in single combat, spraying the American ship with machine gun fire with the aim of taking down American sailors. USS Wainwright's response was instant. She fixed her Mark 42 gun and Harpoon missile launchers for one lethal attack. The battle between a highly advanced behemoth of steel and a David-sized Iranian ship was about to begin. USS Wainwright DLG-28 was the third U.S. Navy ship to bear the name of Civil War-era hero Commander Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright. The brave American sailor had served with distinction in engagements at Forts Jackson and St. Philip with great success before losing his life at the Battle of Galveston in 1863. Still, his legacy lived on in naval history due to his intrepid nature. The third USS Wainwright was laid down on July 2, 1962 at Bath, Maine by the Bath Iron Works Corporation and launched on April 25, 1965, sponsored by Richard W. Wainwright, as the United States prepared for direct military involvement in Vietnam. Half a year later, on January 8, 1966, she was commissioned at the Boston Naval Shipyard with Captain Robert P. Foreman in command. USS Wainwright was a Belknap-class cruiser, a class of single-ended guided missile cruisers that, unlike double-ended missile cruisers, its missile armament was only installed forward. When commissioned, the Belknap-class's main armament included a 5-inch 54 caliber Mark 42 gun mounted on the quarterdeck, and a twin-rail RIM-2 Terrier Mark 10 launcher on the foredeck with over 40 SN-2ER missiles. Wainwright's Mark 10 missile launcher could also launch 20 REUR-5 ASROC all-weather, all-sea conditions anti-submarine missiles, without an additional Mark 112 ASROC launcher. As decades passed, the armament would be revamped, including 2 Phalanx automated gun-based close-in weapon systems, 2 Mark 46 torpedo launchers, and 2 Harpoon missile launchers. The Phalanx close-in weapon system was a state-of-the-art automated defense system designed specifically for anti-ship missiles and aircraft threats. It comprised a radar-controlled Gatling gun that rapidly fired armor-piercing rounds into any upcoming threat. Wainwright's propulsion system comprised 4 1,200-pound-per-square-inch boilers, 2 geared steam turbines, and 2 shafts providing over 85,000 horsepower. This allowed the ship to reach a top speed of over 32 knots. The Belknap-class cruiser was also equipped with sophisticated AN/SPS-10 surface search radar, AN/SPS-48 3D air search radar, AN/SPS-49 2D air search radar, and two AN/SPG-55 Terrier missile fire control radar, providing the vessel with constant eyes in the skies and the depths below to affront any upcoming danger. Following her commission under Captain Foreman, USS Wainwright departed for her shakedown cruise, testing her missiles and sonar in the Atlantic. She fired her main gun at Culebra Island and launched several Terrier missiles. In April 1967, she transited the Panama Canal and arrived in San Diego, California, before leaving for Pearl Harbor. Wainwright then made her way across the Pacific, bound for Southeast Asia, to support the American troops fighting the communist forces in Vietnam. On June 6, 1967, USS Wainwright arrived at the Gulf of Tonkin to begin her first tour in Vietnam. She took Positive Identification Radar Advisory Zone, or PIRAZ, duties from USS Long Beach and began operating in the Gulf, maintaining visual surveillance and radar to identify hostile aircraft near the coasts. This job kept the vessel in the same spot for a long time, serving as a reference point for friendly strike aircraft flying above it, bound to attack targets ashore. USS Wainwright's duties also provided help to search and rescue helicopters, which also used her as a base for takeoff. During this time, an SAR helicopter crashed on USS Wainwright's flight deck, but damage was minimal. After these surveillance operations, the cruiser visited Sasebo in Okinawa before resuming PIRAZ duty in August. Wainwright's 27 days of operations finished on September 8th, after she surveyed the Gulf and visited the British colony of Hong Kong for 5 days. For her third tour, Wainwright served as a screen commander for 2 aircraft carriers operating on Yankee Station and an anti-aircraft warfare command ship that supported all the units of Task Force 77. On September 28, 1967, USS Wainwright and her crew completed their final assignment in Vietnam and departed the combat zone in Southeast Asia. Starting in 1968 in Charleston, USS Wainwright swiftly transitioned to her role as a school ship for the destroyer school in Newport. After a brief return to Charleston, her operations spanned rugby match exercises to increase her readiness in the West Indies. Transiting the Panama Canal in late June 1968, months after the launch of North Vietnam's unexpected Tet Offensive, USS Wainwright visited strategic waypoints such as Pearl Harbor, Guam, and Subic Bay en route to her combat duty station in Indochina. Stationed once again on PIRAZ duty, Wainwright survived a typhoon and returned promptly to her post, despite the unexpected attack from Mother Nature. Relieved in mid-September, she embarked on a series of port visits, a global testament to American military might. Resuming PIRAZ duty in late October 1968, USS Wainwright effectively controlled the airspace over the Gulf of Tonkin. In January 1969, Wainwright began her final tour of duty as a PIRAZ ship, showcasing her persistence in such an important role. The voyage home took her through the Philippines, Subic Bay, and a trans-Pacific journey marked by stops in Sydney, Auckland, and Papeete. Returning to Charleston in February, she entered a period of inspections before embarking on dynamic exercises, including a presidential sea power demonstration and participation in exotic dancer and spark plug exercises. In August, she underwent her first regular overhaul at the Charleston Naval Shipyard, a testament to her enduring service in the U.S. Navy. After resuming operational status in February 1970, USS Wainwright engaged in rigorous training off the coasts of Florida and Virginia. In mid-March, she set off for the Atlantic Fleet Weapons Range near Puerto Rico, undertaking gunnery and missile exercises. In late April, Wainwright received orders to intercept 3 Haitian Coast Guard vessels fleeing an unsuccessful coup. While encountering one vessel near Guantanamo Bay, she stood guard as American officials boarded the vessels peacefully to defuse the situation. Later, Wainwright escorted the 2 remaining ships back to Guantanamo. A different mission arose in May 1970 when she set out to intercept a Soviet task group. Engaging 2 Russian ships, including a guided missile cruiser and destroyer, she witnessed the arrival of 2 submarines, an oiler and a submarine tender. Together, they entered port at Cienfuegos, Cuba, marking a significant diplomatic encounter reminiscent of the 1962 missile crisis. Following this period, Wainwright returned to Guantanamo Bay for more training. In June, she moored at Charleston for 2 months of essential upkeep and training, gearing up for her imminent deployment to the Far East as part of President Nixon's policy of Vietnamization. Embarking on her third and final deployment to Indochina in August, Wainwright transited via the Panama Canal and Pearl Harbor, arriving in Yokosuka, Japan by September 1970. Over the next 2 months, she conducted operations in Japanese waters, focusing on bilateral ASW exercises in the Sea of Japan, alongside Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force units. Periodic stops in Yokosuka and Sasebo provided moments of respite and maintenance. In early November, USS Wainwright headed to the Taiwan Strait to reach the familiar waters of the Gulf of Tonkin for her last tour of duty in Vietnam before the conflict ended. In the early hours of November 21, 1970, USS Wainwright took part in one of the greatest special operations deceptions in modern warfare to assist the Army and Air Force in rescuing American prisoners of war from Sun Tai in North Vietnam. Seaborne radar on board the USS Wainwright and the Navy's Air Traffic Control Station Red Crown would monitor all aircraft over the Gulf of Tonkin. Any ship equipped with NTDS could selectively monitor any activity in real time, with updates from each new sweep of the Wainwright's radar antenna. Over more than 2 hours, Wainwright's radar controllers tracked unprecedented numbers of blacked-out and radio-silenced Navy and Air Force aircraft that flew multiple paths overland, north of Haiphong and over the Gulf of Tonkin. These paths, or tracks, had time and altitude separations, but the aircraft crossed each other in congested locations, always paying attention to monitor coded altitude data squawked by each aircraft's IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe transmitter. Thanks to Wainwright's PIRAS coverage, the assets deployed for the operation had complete access to the entire region, from the Gulf of Tonkin to the mountains that went beyond the Black River of North Vietnam. The Navy could track aircraft in real time as they flew across the skies from one point to another. As if that was not enough, the Navy could also monitor and listen to radio frequencies from both friendly and hostile aircraft. All these data were displayed on screens that allowed the U.S. to provide timely inputs on enemy NVA responses to attacks. While the Navy and Air Force took over the skies to distract the enemy with the info provided by Wainwright, the Army launched a raiding force of 6 helicopters, 2 large support aircraft, and 5 small attack aircraft from Thailand in the early hours of November 20th, 1970, bound for the Sun Tai prison camp. The diversion conducted by the aircraft led by Wainwright was a complete success. Still, the ground operation was not triumphant at all. The Green Berets discovered the POWs had been evacuated beforehand. Nevertheless, the Sun Tai raid proved what the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces could achieve by working together, laying the groundwork for future Joint Forces operations. On November 14, 1970, Wainwright relieved USS Jouett on PIRAS Station as the American Air Coordinator in the northern part of the Gulf. Shortly after, the reliable cruiser was relieved by USS Chicago. Still, Wainwright kept the role of the coordinator ship, designated for the North SAR Station. She navigated between the North and South SAR stations for nearly a month, participating in Operation Beacon Tower in mid-December. The 3-day exercise increased the preparedness of U.S. Navy vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin against NVA air and surface threats. On December 16th, Wainwright departed the combat zone, setting course for Singapore, where she stayed to celebrate Christmas. She then headed for the Philippines, reaching Subic Bay on December 29th. Wainwright left the Philippines on January 4th, 1971, bound for Hong Kong. Following a 4-day visit, she left the British colony en route to the Gulf of Tonkin for 2 intense weeks of operations. Throughout the year, Wainwright participated in more training exercises in the Atlantic and conducted patrols in South America, the Caribbean, and Africa. In January 1972, the cruiser underwent a conversion process before a tour of the Mediterranean Sea. In December, the ship's crew visited Rota, Spain, before venturing into the Mediterranean, where she conducted anti-ship and anti-air warfare exercises with Allied vessels. While conducting these exercises in Greek waters, USS Wainwright successfully tracked, contacted, and identified 4 Soviet submarines, despite the communist efforts to evade contact with NATO vessels. After her successful European tours, Wainwright returned to the U.S. and underwent an overhaul. In March 1975, she became the first American ship to visit Romania in over 50 years. On April 18, 1988, USS Wainwright played a pivotal role in Operation Praying Mantis, a retaliatory action by U.S. Navy forces in response to the Iranian mining of USS Samuel B. Roberts. This guided missile frigate was patrolling the Persian Gulf before the incident. This mining of the U.S. ship, which occurred on April 14th, was taken as a direct threat to America's Operation Earnest Will, whose purpose was to safeguard reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers from Iranian attacks in the Persian Gulf. In the aftermath of the incident, U.S. Navy divers located additional mines in the vicinity, with their serial numbers linking them to those previously confiscated from the Iranian Air Force in September 1987. The American naval response was swift. An immediate counteroffensive was born to avenge USS Samuel B. Roberts, Operation Praying Mantis, which turned out to be the largest surface action for American forces since World War II ended. On April 18, 1988, a coalition of surface warships, complemented by aircraft from USS Enterprise, executed the operation. In close cooperation with two destroyers and the amphibious transport dock USS Trenton, Wainwright launched a coordinated strike on the Sasan and Siri oil platforms. The operation saw U.S. Marines descending onto the Sasan platform, gathering crucial intelligence and strategically disabling it. In response, Iran dispatched Baghamar speedboats to launch attacks across the Persian Gulf. An American A-6E intruder aircraft from VA-95 targeted the speedboats, sinking one and inflicting damage on several others. The intensity escalated further as Iranian Kaman-class fast attack craft Jashan challenged Wainwright. It launched a Harpoon missile, prompting Wainwright to retaliate with 4 Standard missiles. Additional strikes from USS Bagley culminated in the destruction of Jashan. The Iranian frigate Sahand then entered the fray, taking the fight to elements of another American surface group. In an exchange of missiles, Sahand was inevitably sunk against the superior naval power of the American ships, leading to another victory for U.S. Navy forces. Operation Praying Mantis resulted in the sinking of 2 Iranian warships and up to 6 armed speedboats. It also marked the first ever surface-to-surface missile engagement in U.S. Navy history. This decisive operation compelled Iran to agree to a ceasefire with Iraq later that summer, putting an end to the 8-year-long conflict between both nations. Wainwright was decommissioned on November 10, 1992, and remained in the reserve fleet for almost a decade. In June 2002, the British Royal Navy used her as a live fire target. She was struck by 2 Harpoon missiles fired from HMS Richmond. The missiles did not put her down, and Wainwright remained afloat during the night. The next day, she was struck by a spearfish torpedo fired from the submarine HMS Tireless, striking the bow. Shortly after, American aircraft made a strafing run, severely damaging her, before she was ultimately sent to the depths with explosive charges. A sister ship in flames, its German assailant lurking in the shadows, and time slipping away in the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. In the midst of chaos, HMCS Haida embarked on a daring World War II rescue operation that would define its legacy. At the helm was Captain DeWolf, known as Hardover Harry, as strong and resilient as the Canadian destroyer he commanded. With the lives of comrades hanging in the balance and the dark silhouette of enemy vessels on the horizon, he faced an unthinkable choice: continue the rescue, risking an attack from more German vessels, or cease the operation, leaving behind friends and allies. The ship would make a decision it would ultimately come to regret, one that would later send it on a merciless rampage of revenge for the rest of the war. Originating in design studies from the mid-1930s, the Tribal, or Afridi class, was initially envisioned as a light fleet cruiser. Yet, as the Japanese, Italian, and German navies unveiled innovative designs, the Tribal soon adapted into agile destroyers. Envisioned to be larger in stature, its designers prioritized guns over torpedoes more than their predecessors, emphasizing anti-ship warfare but still upholding potent anti-aircraft defenses. As such, housing a crew of nearly 190 men, the Tribal class towered over the standard destroyers of their era, stretching to about 377 feet and displacing up to 2,519 tons when fully laden. Of the 27 Tribal class vessels crafted, 16 sailed for the Royal Navy, 3 for the Australian Navy, and 8 bore the Canadian flag. Soon after their introduction, these destroyers showcased their prowess across World War II's vast naval theaters. During their tenure, the ships were both cherished by their crews and revered by the public. Among them was the Royal Canadian Navy's HMCS Haida. As the 4th Tribal to grace the Royal Canadian Navy, Haida was commissioned on August 30th, 1943, with the seasoned Harry de Wolfe at its helm. With a quarter-century of naval expertise under his belt, de Wolfe aimed to elevate Canada's maritime reputation. By the end of 1943, after rigorous sea trials, Haida secured her place within the 3rd Canadian Destroyer Flotilla and part of the British Home Fleet. The ongoing Battle of the Atlantic meant Allied convoys were in need of strong protectors against the persistent threats of German U-boats and surface raiders. In this challenging and ever-changing backdrop, Haida was ready to take on a pivotal role. At first glance, her primary armament comprised 6 dominant 4.7-inch QF Mark 12 guns aligned in 3 twin mounts, which was enough to scare almost any floating enemy away. For the skyward enemies, her defenses included a lone but powerful 4-inch QF Mark 5 gun, augmented by full robust 2-pounder QF Mark 8 guns, always on the lookout for hostile aircraft. Hidden below her decks, a menacing foursome of 21-inch torpedo tubes stood in the unique quad setup, awaiting a chance to challenge larger-sized foes. Deeper still, where only submarines dared to venture, Haida had her depth charges at the ready. In November, she was assigned as an escort for the Russian convoy RA-54B, one of many Arctic convoys that transported essential supplies to the Soviet Union. The cold waters, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of torpedoes made these missions particularly risky. During one journey, the Kriegsmarine battleship Scharnhorst attempted to intercept the convoy. While the escorting cruisers managed to keep the German vessel occupied, Haida and her fellow destroyers guided the convoy away from the threat. On December 23rd, the convoy faced an attack once more, this time from Junkers Ju-88 bombers. Again, Haida's defenses ensured the convoy went undamaged. Besides her convoy escort duties, Haida was involved in offensive operations along the Norwegian coast, engaging German naval vessels when the opportunity arose. By January 10, 1944, Haida had moved to the 10th Destroyer Flotilla in Plymouth. There, she and her crew participated in Operation Tunnel and Operation Hostile, operations in the Bay of Biscay and along the French coast of the English Channel, aimed at confronting and neutralizing the fast German naval vessels that posed a threat to Allied naval movements. Haida was a key player in these operations with her advanced anti-ship and anti-submarine weaponry. By the spring, she had completed almost 20 missions under Operation Tunnel and Operation Hostile. In mid-April 1944, Haida, along with her sister ships HMS Ashanti, HMCS Athabaskan, HMCS Huron, and the Dido-class cruiser HMS Black Prince, embarked on an Operation Hostile mission in the English Channel. Days passed, with the ships weaving through waters, their radar systems alive with signals, all with a direct yet perilous mission: detect the enemy and engage. In the early hours of April 26th, they confronted the German 4th Torpedo Boat Flotilla, which boasted the Evelyn-class torpedo boats T-29, T-24, and T-27. Though named torpedo boats, these German vessels essentially matched mid-size Allied destroyers in size, albeit with slightly less firepower. T-27 took damage early on and retreated. The unforgiving guns aboard Haida sent T-29 to the ocean floor, while T-24, though wounded, managed to flee. A little more than 48 hours later, while on patrol off St. Brieuc near Brittany, both Athabaskan and Haida received intel of 2 enemy ships nearby. The duo pressed on. However, the crew of Haida soon discerned a concerning sight. Athabaskan had suddenly stopped. It was April 29, 1944, and Athabaskan had just fallen victim to a torpedo launched by T-27, the very boat that had eluded them earlier. Grasping the gravity of the situation, Commander de Wolfe of Haida immediately launched a counteroffensive, warding off the German assailant. Yet, despite his best efforts, Athabaskan was overwhelmed by flames. The sister ship was going down. Having pursued T-27 and set her aground, showering her with shells, Haida made her way back. Drawing close to her sister ship, she fired a star shell, illuminating the darkness and signaling the beginning of a rescue mission. Deploying her boats, floats, and scramble nets, Haida's valiant crew pulled aboard scores of oil-slicked men, some dazed, others wounded, all grateful. Every ounce of de Wolfe's determination was poured into rescuing as many comrades as possible. Yet as they worked, he knew all too well that peril was on the horizon. The very German boats that had damaged Arabaskan were still in the vicinity. Every second in this vulnerable position heightened the risk of Haida becoming their next target. Amid this backdrop, and with dawn threatening to blow their cover, Captain de Wolf made the heart-wrenching decision to cease the rescue. The toll was heavy. Arabaskan lost 128 brave souls, including her captain, John Stubbs. A further 83 men were captured, becoming prisoners of war. Yet, thanks to Haida, 44 fortunate men found refuge aboard her decks. The Canadian Tribal-class destroyer persistently carried out Operation Hostile sorties alongside her sister ship, Huron, in the suspense-filled weeks leading up to Operation Overlord. As the historic invasion of Normandy began, Haida, steadfastly standing as part of the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, played a pivotal role in providing cover for surface attacks at the far western entrance of the English Channel. Merely days later, in a synchronized maritime ballet, Haida and Huron joined forces to sink the submarine Z-32 in the iconic Battle of Ushant. With the fall of Cherbourg, the formidable Kriegsmarine E-boats that had long shadowed and threatened Haida were subsequently relocated. This strategic shift freed Haida and her flotilla from their persistent menace. In the ensuing period, the flotilla was endowed with dual responsibilities. They protected Allied torpedo boat flotillas and relentlessly embarked on search and sink operations against German vessels along the entirety of the French coast. On June 24th, the inseparable sister ships, Haida and Eskimo, sank one more enemy boat and rescued 6 of her survivors. Throughout July and August, Haida was on a mission to intercept and counter German vessels. In this period, she sank a notable tally of submarine chasers, minesweepers, and patrol boats, always in unison with her convoy. Haida became renowned for her unmatched destructive prowess, impressively sinking 9 enemy ships between April and September of 1944. This remarkable success can be largely credited to one exceptional leader. During Harry de Wolf's distinguished 14 months tenure as Haida's commanding officer, she sank an astounding 14 enemy vessels. De Wolf's brave, courageous, and inspirational leadership rightfully earned him the enduring nickname Hard Over Harry. After being promoted to captain in September, de Wolf was slated for a return to Canada, meaning he'd have to leave Haida. Though de Wolf commanded a fleet of ships during his illustrious naval career, his profound connection with Haida became a defining feature of his legacy. Over the ensuing years, this fearless leader climbed to the rank of Vice Admiral, eventually taking the reins of the Royal Canadian Navy. However, the story of Haida in World War II still had chapters left. With the change in leadership, Haida, holding her head high, departed Western Europe on September 22nd for Halifax, Nova Scotia, to receive state-of-the-art radar. For the rest of that year, Haida predominantly sailed on escort missions. Towards the end of the war, Haida played a role in one of the last Canadian naval engagements when she valiantly escorted convoy RA-66 from Venga from late April to early May 1945. During this intense mission, both Haida and her sister ship, Huron, miraculously dodged torpedoes from lurking U-boats. This naval skirmish witnessed the sinking of 2 U-boats and a Royal Navy vessel in the icy waters. After her extensive service, Haida returned to Canada in June 1945. She was earmarked for a refit, but fate had other plans. The refit was abruptly suspended when Japan, marking the end of a global conflict, announced its surrender later that summer. After World War II, HMCS Haida took a brief respite, only to be reactivated in 1947, refitted with contemporary armament, and rebranded as a destroyer escort. Subsequently, Haida and her sister ship, HMCS Nootka, participated in exercises with the Canadian Navy's Atlantic Fleet, the U.S. Navy, and the Royal Navy. By November 1949, she was back in Halifax, Canada. She was swiftly enlisted to rescue 18 crew members from a U.S. Air Force bomber that had crashed in the Atlantic. Yet, only a month later, being one of the older vessels in the Navy's lineup, she was downgraded to serve as a depot and accommodation ship in Halifax. The onset of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, saw Haida reactivated for combat once again. Refitted the subsequent month with fresh armaments and cutting-edge sensors, she spent 2 patrols off the Korean coast, escorting aircraft carriers and executing coastal bombardments. After striking a train north of Rewan and neutralizing a rogue anti-ship mine in January 1953, Haida was inducted into the esteemed Train Busters Club, performing essential train-busting operations. By December, despite the ceasefire, she remained in the area to be a strong Allied naval presence. Post-Korea, Haida undertook anti-submarine warfare tasks alongside other North Atlantic and West Indies NATO vessels. However, by 1958, the wear and tear became more evident than ever. Her hull cracked, equipment malfunctioned, and steering faltered. A 1958 refit for repairs only briefly postponed the inevitable. After a 1960 voyage to the West Indies was cut short due to equipment failures, more structural concerns surfaced. This war hero's finale was imminent. In 1963, after one final and sentimental tour of the Great Lakes, she was set for scrapping. Remarkably, she was the last survivor of the 27 tribal-class ships. All her counterparts had either been lost in combat accidents or had been decommissioned. Not willing to let their beloved and iconic ship go, a group of ex-crew members, wishing to safeguard her legacy, acquired the ship. Their dedication ensured Haida's restoration, and by 1984, she was recognized as a National Historic Site. Her unparalleled adaptability to evolving battle scenarios, reinforced by superior design, a hint of luck, and most importantly, the indomitable spirit of her crew, ensured her prolonged survival. Today, HMCS Haida stands tall, celebrated as the fightingest ship in the Royal Canadian Navy. This moniker is not just a testament to her combat prowess, but a tribute to the undying spirit and determination of her crew throughout the decades. In 1988, the Iran-Iraq War raged in the treacherous combat zones of the Persian Gulf. Amidst the chaos, no foreign ship, merchant or military, was safe. Not even U.S. Navy ships were immune. In a stunning event, the USS Samuel B. Roberts was nearly blown apart by a mysterious, unidentified naval mine. U.S. Navy explosive ordnance disposal divers scoured the area for evidence and eventually stumbled upon an astonishing truth. Serial numbers on the mines matched those from an Iranian ship stormed by Navy SEAL commandos. America vowed revenge and launched Operation Praying Mantis to knock Iran back in its place. It would be one of the largest U.S. naval surface operations since World War II. The primary mission would be to decimate Iranian naval power in the region, but the U.S. Navy also had its eyes set on an unexpected and unconventional target, one that might have even been illegal. In 1979, the pro-American Shah of Iran was overthrown in a violent revolution that resulted in the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, led by Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This uprising ended a close relationship the U.S. Navy had forged with the Iranian Navy and the Shah to become Cold War allies against the Soviet Union. As part of this alliance, the U.S. had supplied Iran with the latest weaponry available, including F-14 Tomcat fighters armed with Phoenix long-range air-to-air missiles, P-3 Orion ASW aircraft, and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. As if this was not enough, the Navy was about to build 4 destroyers for the Iranian Navy that were left incomplete after the uprising. These ships were often referred to as the Ayatollah or the Khomeini class. In September 1980, Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein launched a large-scale military offensive into Iran to make the most out of the chaos that had engulfed Iran due to the revolution. Long-standing border disputes, territorial ambitions, and ideological differences regarding religion and politics were also reasons behind the clash between both nations. Iraq and Iran sought the upper hand by deploying numerous armies, advanced weapons, and brutal tactics to maintain or reconquer more territory. The war raged for almost a decade and began to wane in 1988 when ceasefire negotiations commenced. Trench warfare, chemical attacks, and indiscriminate bombings resulted in numerous civilian casualties, displacement, and entire cities reduced to rubble. Iran and Iraq suffered heavily, leaving behind a trail of destruction. International powers, especially the United States, played a significant role in the conflict. The U.S. government and other Western nations, including the Soviet Union, provided Iraq with weapons, supplies, diplomatic support, intelligence sharing, and economic flow to finish off Iran. The ongoing conflict quickly spread to the Persian Gulf, where the US-trained Iranian Navy and Air Force gained the edge. In retaliation, Iraq began to attack Iranian shipping in the northern Gulf. This gave way to the tanker war. By 1987, Iran had conducted 168 attacks against merchant shipping, while Iraq had performed over 283. Soon, the entire Persian Gulf was in flames. In response, Kuwait called for international assistance to protect its tankers, which were targeted by Iranian ships and aircraft. Some tankers were allowed to employ the U.S. flag to protect them from escalating attacks. U.S. Navy vessels were also deployed in the Persian Gulf as part of Operation Earnest Will to escort reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Persian Gulf to protect them from being attacked by Iraqi and Iranian military personnel. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran increased in late 1987 and 1988. Iran began to lay hundreds of minefields in the Arabian Gulf. Some tankers were struck by mines, causing international outrage and leading to the capture of the Iran Ajr, the vessel responsible for laying the mines. In early 1988, the U.S. Navy was given more liberal rules of engagement to interfere against engagements on neutral ships, deterring possible attacks from Iran or Iraq. In February, the frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts was deployed to the Gulf to assist the U.S. Navy task force. The frigate kept Iranian warships and aircraft away from tankers and supported secret mobile operating bases. More importantly, she kept the Iranian frigate Sabalan at bay from attacking merchant vessels. On April 14th, USS Samuel B. Roberts was returning from a successful escort when one of her lookouts spotted 3 mines ahead. The ship stopped, and Commander Paul Rinn ordered every sailor available to reach the main deck. While backing down, the vessel struck an Iranian moored contact mine. An explosion destroyed the keel, flooding the ship with over 2,000 tons of water. A massive fireball went up through the ship's deck. The crew miraculously fought the fire and cabled the superstructure together. The Iranian Sabalan showed up late at night, but kept her distance. The ship barely stayed afloat and was then towed away. 10 crewmen required medevac, but survived. This incident was enough for the U.S. Navy. It was time to retaliate and hunt down the Iranian ships laying mines across the Persian Gulf. While Iranian and Iraqi ground troops were engaged in Al-Fa Peninsula after Saddam Hussein launched a massive counteroffensive led by the Republican Guard, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Praying Mantis on April 18, 1988. The primary objective of Mantis was to sink the Iranian frigate Sabalan, held responsible for the damage to USS Samuel B. Roberts. The broader objective was to inflict enough damage on the Iranian Navy to deter it from laying more mines in the Arabian Gulf. Praying Mantis was the largest of 5 U.S. Navy surface operations since World War II. Rear Admiral Anthony Less was the commander of Mantis and had Joint Task Force Middle East aboard USS Coronado under his command. The task force was supported by Battle Group Foxtrot under Rear Admiral Guy Zeller, commander Cruiser Destroyer Group 3 on USS Enterprise. Mantis began at 8 a.m. when Surface Action Group Bravo reached Iran's Sisan oil platform with a one-time warning. USS Merrill told the Iranians they had 20 minutes to abandon the platform before destroying it. Some Iranians refused and opened fire with their anti-aircraft guns. A Marine AH-1 helicopter intervened to finish off resistance and clear the area for U.S. Marines that boarded the platform. They captured 1 prisoner, gathered intelligence, and placed explosives for detonation. Group Bravo then advanced towards the Raksh oil platform with the same objective. While on the way, SAG Bravo, which comprised USS Merrill, USS Trenton, and USS Lind McCormick, was attacked by 2 Iranian F-4 Phantoms. The attack ended abruptly, however, when Lind McCormick locked onto the aircraft with missile fire control radar. In an attempt to de-escalate, the attack on the Raksh oil platform was called off before SAG Bravo arrived at the location. Nevertheless, SAG Charlie continued their objective: destroy the Siri oil platform. After the expected warning to leave the platform, USS Wainwright, USS Simpson, and USS Bagley opened fire. 1 shell hit a compressed gas tank, caused a massive fireball, and took the lives of an Iranian gun crew. While the 2 task groups attacked the oil platforms, Iran deployed several speedboats from its naval forces and ordered them to attack any non-Iranian vessel in their path. Armed with Soviet RPGs and different types of machine guns and assault rifles, the speedboats damaged one American, one British, and one Panamanian merchant vessel. As the operation progressed, a VA-95 A6E intruder aircraft from USS Enterprise took off to engage 4 enemy speedboats. The intruder had a tough time targeting the small and fast boats, but sank one with a Rockeye cluster bomb during its second pass. The rest fled the scene. Besides the speedboats, Iran also deployed the Common-class missile patrol boat Joshan under the command of Captain Abbas Malik. Although her orders were unclear regarding what to do when faced with American ships, Joshan approached the location of Syri oil platform. The stage was set for a naval engagement. 3 hours later, the Iranian ship was detected by USS Wainwright. Captain Chandler, who commanded the vessel, knew through intelligence reports that Joshan was carrying the last Harpoon anti-ship missile on Iran's inventory. Knowing he could not engage unless fired upon, Captain Chandler broadcasted several warnings to Joshan, ordering her to turn away or face the consequences. Captain Malik answered by radio, quote, "I am doing my duty. I am in international waters and will commit no provocative attack." Joshan kept advancing toward USS Wainwright. At 13 miles, the U.S. Navy ship issued more warnings, but received no response. Instead, Joshan locked onto USS Wainwright with her fire control radar. Captain Chandler made one last warning, quote,
"Stop and abandon ship. I intend to sink you. Over."
Joshan immediately launched its last Harpoon missile at Wainwright, who fired one standard missile in surface-to-surface mode. USS Simpson, which was nearby, also opened fire. After 4 hits, Joshan's superstructure was left in critical condition, but did not sink. Miraculously, the Harpoon's missile failed to activate and passed close to Wainwright's starboard side. In the chaos, 2 enemy F-4 Phantom fighter bombers showed up, and Wainwright directly engaged them with 2 missiles. One took evasive maneuvers, and the other was left with a large hole in one wing and limped back to base. SAG Charlie then turned its attention to Joshan and finished the job. Later in the day, the Somme-class frigate Sahand engaged aircraft from USS Joseph Strauss with SAM fire. The U.S. Navy vessel retaliated with Harpoon and Skipper missiles that sank the Iranian ship after a massive explosion. Meanwhile, other Navy ships from SAG Delta approached Bandar Abbas base, from which Sabalan quickly departed. The Iranian ship was detected by an A-6 aircraft flown by Lieutenant Commander James Engler. After verifying her identity, Engler approached the enemy ship and fired a laser-guided bomb that crippled the ship, leaving her dead in the water. This marked the last engagement of Operation Praying Mantis and triggered a ceasefire. Sabalan was towed back to her base, and the U.S. task force returned to neutral waters. The only American casualty was a Marine Corps AH-1T Sea Cobra helicopter gunship that crashed near Abu Musa Island. Despite the ceasefire, the U.S. and Iran would face each other again in July 1988 during the tragic shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655 by USS Vincennes. The USS Sea Lion II, a Palau-class submarine, was on her 3rd war patrol in the Pacific. Commissioned in March of 1944, the vessel and her crew had already proven their worth by sinking multiple Japanese vessels off the coast of China and Korea. At 2:20 a.m. on November 21st, the submarine made radar contact with a Japanese formation moving through the Formosa Strait. The vessels, 2 cruisers, 2 battleships, and 3 destroyer escorts, were moving at a speed of approximately 16 knots and were not zigzagging. Although the crew aboard Sea Lion did not know it yet, they were about to engage Admiral Takeo Kurita's first strike force, fresh out of Brunei. Nonetheless, Sea Lion's crew quickly went into battle formations to face the enemy head-on. Their first target was Kongo, also known as the Indestructible Diamond, one of the Imperial Navy's most heavily armed and armored battleships. The odds were against Sea Lion II, but her crew was confident they could pull it off. The United States Navy's Palau-class submarines were an improved version of the earlier Gato-class submarines. Named after the Palau half-beak fish species, the class was introduced in early 1943. USS Sea Lion II, the second American vessel to bear the moniker, was named after the species of large-eared seals native to the Pacific Ocean. Her keel was laid down on February 25th by the renowned Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and she was launched on October 31st, sponsored by Vice Admiral Emery Land and his wife. The second Sea Lion was officially commissioned 5 months later, with Lieutenant Commander Eli T. Reich at the helm. The Below-class diesel-electric submarine had a length of 311 feet, a beam of 27 feet, and a maximum draft of 16 feet. She displaced 1,526 long tons when surfaced and 2,463 tons when submerged. Powered by 4 General Motors Model 16278A V16 diesel engines, 4 high-speed GE electric motors, and 2-cell Sargo batteries, USS Sea Lion II could achieve speeds of 20.25 knots on the surface and 8.75 knots when fully submerged. In addition, the submarine boasted a maximum range of over 11,000 nautical miles at a speed of over 10 knots. The submarine had a complement of 10 officers and over 70 enlisted men, and was armed with 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 tubes forward and 4 aft, carrying a total of 24 torpedoes. And to counter enemy aircraft, she was armed with a 5-inch 25-caliber deck gun, Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft guns, and Bofors 40mm guns. Sea Lion II engaged Japanese vessels for the first time on June 23, 1944, after arriving at the Osumi Gunto Island Group located south of Kyushu. However, she did not score any hits and had to maneuver to escape the enemy's depth charges. The vessel then joined another hunting party of submarines and approached the Korean peninsula to track down Japanese ships. On June 28th, she claimed her first victim, after she sank the naval transport Sansei Maru off the shores of Tsushima Island. 2 days later, the submarine used her deck guns for the first time to sink a sampan in the Korean archipelago. Sea Lion II then made her way to the coast of China to patrol Shanghai, where she intercepted a convoy south of the Four Sisters Islands on July 6th. The crew commenced the torpedo attack at approximately 4:50 in the morning, and within minutes, the Setsuzan Maru had been dispatched to the depths, causing the convoy to disperse. At 6 a.m., an Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer and aircraft arrived to hunt down Sea Lion II, which failed to sink the enemy vessel despite firing several torpedoes. The chase persisted until late in the evening, but Sea Lion emerged unscathed. On July 11th, the determined American crew savored victory once again, having sunk 2 freighters, Suksi Maru II and Taian Maru II. Sea Lion II embarked on her second war patrol alongside USS Growler and Pomponido on August 17, 1944. The Wolf ventured into the South China Sea, where they encountered a Japanese convoy on the night of August 30th. The submarines inflicted severe damage on the Riko Maru tanker with surface fire, but they were engaged by the deck guns of other Japanese vessels. Sea Lion II disengaged the convoy and later counterattacked, sinking the mine layer Shirataka. She then returned to Saipan to be refueled and resupplied. On September 7th, the Belau-class submarine rejoined her attack group and approached the Balintang Channel, where they decimated an enemy convoy bound for the island of Formosa. A destroyer, a tanker, and a transport ship were set ablaze by the combined fire of torpedoes and deck guns. Soon, however, Sea Lion II and her hunting party inadvertently partook in one of the most tragic blue-on-blue incidents of the war, when they sank Rakyo Maru and Kachidoki Maru. These 2 Japanese vessels were transporting over 2,220 Australian and British prisoners of war, and it's estimated that over 1,600 of them perished. Upon realizing their tragic error, the U.S. Navy submarine surfaced and managed to rescue over 150 Allied POWs. The remaining 500 survivors were later picked up by Japanese Navy destroyers and transported to mainland Japan. Sea Lion II then returned to Pearl Harbor and departed a few days later in the company of USS Keat. She was about to face the greatest threat to her entire submarine career. USS Sea Lion II and Keat returned to the familiar waters of the East China Sea in late October of 1944. Although the pair tracked down several convoys, they refrained from engaging any near Shanghai. At 2:20 a.m. on November 21st, Sea Lion II established radar contact with the Japanese formation, traveling through the Formosa Strait at about 16 knots. Unbeknownst to Sea Lion II and her task force, they were about to confront Admiral Takeo Kurita's First Strike Force, which had narrowly escaped a daring Allied air raid on Brunei Island. The flagship of Kurita's fleet was Kongo, meaning indestructible diamond, named after the formidable Mount Kongo in Japan's Osaka Prefecture. As the lead ship of the Kongo-class battleships, Kongo was the most active vessel in the Imperial Navy. With a displacement of over 36,600 tons, she was heavily armed. Her primary armament consisted of 8 14-inch main guns distributed across 4 large turrets in a forward and aft configuration, while her secondary armament included 16 6-inch and 8 3-inch guns, along with an additional 8 21-inch torpedo tubes. Kongo was also well armored, boasting a main armor belt that was 8 inches thick and a deck that was nearly 3 inches thick. Moreover, the faces of the main turrets were protected by 9-inch thick armor. Soon, her convoy made contact with Sea Lion II and her hunting party. Upon establishing radar contact with the Japanese formation, Sea Lion II's task force grasped the magnitude of the situation before them. There were 2 battleships and 2 cruisers. Then, at around 2:40 a.m., 3 additional ships showed up. The challenge was on, and the U.S. Navy task force adopted battle formations, with Sea Lion II spearheading the assault. Admiral Kurita had instructed his ships to maintain a speed of over 17 knots without zigzagging, relying on a strategic minefield that stretched from north of Formosa along the Ryukyu Islands to Honshu. Believed to be impenetrable for any American vessel, including submarines, the minefield was of little concern to Sea Lion and her hunting party. At approximately 2:55 a.m., Sea Lion fired 6 torpedoes at the second ship in the formation. 3 minutes later, she fired 3 torpedoes toward one of the battleships. The crew then witnessed 3 explosions from the first salvo, confirming the successful sinking of the destroyer Yurikaze. As Sea Lion maneuvered for another salvo, the crew heard the impact from the second set of torpedoes, which had struck one battleship and dented its armor belt. It was Kongo. Remarkably, Sea Lion's crew captured the attack's audio, using a sound recorder left behind by a CBS war correspondent. The submarine then reloaded as Admiral Kurita's task force began zigzagging to evade incoming torpedoes. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy submarines relentlessly maintained pressure and strategically pursued their quarry. There was no way out. Sea Lion's crew initially believed they had only dented Kongo's thick armor, but the damage inflicted was far more severe, and the formidable vessel began flooding at an alarming rate. It was 3:10 a.m., and Kongo's crew knew the end was imminent. Even so, the crew and the rest of Kurita's force continued to sail following their Bushido principles, dropping depth charges and employing every possible tactic to destroy the enemy pursuing them. At 4:50 a.m., Kurita's task force split into 2 groups to distract the submarines. Sea Lion went after the slower group, which quickly lagged behind due to Kongo's flooding. The battleship's speed gradually diminished until she was left motionless in the water. Then, at 5:24 a.m., Kongo's magazine exploded, and the ship swiftly vanished beneath the waves. Over 1,200 crew members perished, including Vice Admiral Ugaki. Sea Lion's Commander Reich, a proud Irish Catholic, then yelled, quote, "Oh, the luck of the Irish." The lookouts saw nothing. The radar spotted nothing, and the skipper aboard the USS Parchi submarine was desperate and restless to find the elusive Japanese convoy in the South China Sea. The commanding officer hopped back and forth between the radar screen in the conning tower and plot tables in the control room until they finally found it. Commander Lawson Red Ramage then cleared the bridge and steamed directly into the enemy formation up on the surface while maneuvering between the ships. In the words of author Clay Drury Blair Jr., quote, "With consummate seamanship and coolness under fire, Ramage dodged and twisted." The commander then opened fire, and the enemy answered with deck guns and even tried to ram the sneaky submarine. But Ramage was determined to cause as much damage as possible, and the torpedo shooting that night was unlike anything the Japanese had experienced before. The submarine's wolf pack, known as Park's Pirates, departed the island of Midway in mid-June of 1944. Led by Commander Lewis Parks, the pack was tasked with patrolling the area between Formosa and Luzon in a chase for Japanese merchant ships. The group was composed of USS Steelhead, USS Hammerhead, and USS Parche, and Parche's commander suggested that they should be called the Headhunters, given that they had Steelhead, Hammerhead, and himself, Lawson Ramage, a redhead. The veteran of the group was Steelhead, sailing on her 6th patrol. For Parche, it was her 2nd mission, while Hammerhead was on her very first patrol. They were to conduct offensive missions in the South China Sea and destroy any enemy forces they encountered. For centuries, the Luzon Strait, a 230-mile stretch bridging Taiwan and the Philippines, had been a strategic gateway in the region. In the last stages of the Pacific War in mid-1944, Japanese mariners even dubbed the strait the Devil's Sea, as the area was full of lurking American submarines determined to sink their Marus, or merchant ships. The 3 vessels arrived on July 1st and devoted their time to roaming the area, submerged by day and surfaced by night. But for the best part of a month, the headhunters saw little action. Still, according to Red Ramage, the stretch was the most lucrative patrol area in the entire Pacific, or at least it was supposed to be. On July 4th, Parche spotted 3 warships heading southwest. But as the submarine prepared to attack, the Japanese struck first. Ramage was then forced to flee because of the enemy's surprisingly accurate salvos. 2 weeks later, Parche's lookouts found a lone aircraft carrier. Ramage thought it was a, quote, perfect dream come true, but when the carrier launched patrol aircraft, the commander's dream was again frustrated. The following week, there was a report that the Japanese submarine I-29 would sail through the area. Moreover, it was believed that she was carrying strategic materials and blueprints from Germany, thus becoming the Wolfpack's top priority. The American ships formed a picket line to intercept the precious vessel, but it wasn't Parche nor Ramage who claimed the victory. Then, on July 30th, while Ramage and his crew wondered if their disappointment would ever end, promising news finally came through. At 4:20 a.m., Hammerhead reported sighting a convoy only 20 miles south of Parche's position. 18 minutes later, Hammerhead reconfirmed the position and added that she was now engaging the enemy on the port flank. However, as the hours passed, Ramage and even Parks began to suspect that Hammerhead's information was wrong. They should have encountered the convoy 3 hours ago. Then Parks asked the skipper, Lieutenant Commander John Martin, to verify the location. The enemy was now 30 miles north of Parche. Mildly irritated, Ramage turned around and headed there. Before long, the commanders realized that they were moving fast, but going nowhere. Yet again, Parks asked for verification, and Martin reported a revised position at 30 miles to the northwest. By now, Ramage was extremely exasperated, and even wondered if there was an enemy convoy at all. After finishing her unsuccessful attack, Hammerhead departed for Fremantle, Australia. It was later determined that she had miscoded the convoy's positions. In reality, there was indeed a sizable Japanese convoy composed of 18 ships carrying 10,000 troops and thousands of tons of supplies, with 7 warships escorting it. Still, Parche was unaware. Discouraged, Ramage took the boat deep below the water at 6:21 a.m. to avoid enemy anti-submarine patrols. After her futile chase, Parche remained submerged for the entire day, although the crew kept on the lookout through the periscope. At 10:30 in the morning, Steelhead sighted convoy MI-11 and quickly went after it. However, Ramage would not learn the news until several hours later because of being under radio silence. It was only when Parche resurfaced towards the end of the day that her crew picked up a position report from her teammate. The convoy was now crossing the strait 35 miles southwest of Parche, which set off at full speed. It took the crew a few hours to find the enemy, for they had made a radical course change. But the convoy finally popped on the radar, and Ramage called for battle stations. Parche crept in from behind the enemy, but the skipper reckoned it would be best to get ahead of the group. Under cover of darkness, the submarine steamed along the convoy on the surface and towards the 3 lead escorts, when suddenly one of them turned in their direction. Ramage had to pull a reverse spinner to turn the ship's nose around. In an unexpected move, the entire 25-ship convoy also turned 90 degrees, and the Americans came into a direct collision course. The crew had to pull off another sharp turn to get out of their way, before repositioning for a proper attack. Then, at 3:56 a.m., Parche fired 2 bow torpedoes, officially kicking off the battle. Within 10 minutes, Ramage detected what he thought was a pair of aircraft carriers, but in reality were large tankers. Resolved, he launched 4 torpedoes toward one of the tankers. The first ripped off the bow, while the other 3 pierced through the middle, and the Koei Maru did not take long to sink. Then Parche pointed her stern at the other ship, Ogura Maru, and fired 3 more charges. An officer later recalled that the skipper, quote, was in his element, just calmly picking targets. Meanwhile, the Japanese were confused, firing flares and shooting indiscriminately. On the other side of the convoy, Steelhead had launched 2 attacks, with at least 1 hit. But while she had to submerge to reload, Ramage had no desire to lose his advantage on the already alerted enemy. Thus, he decided to reload his empty tubes while maneuvering on the surface. It was unprecedented and risky, as the rocking waves could cause a terrible accident while handling the mines. But Ramage had drilled the crew in the technique. Within minutes, Parche had 2 tubes ready, and at 4:16 a.m., she fired at Dakar Maru, and the 7,000-ton transport slowed to a crawl. Parche then re-engaged the damaged Ogura Maru. With shells whistling overhead, Ramage sent all spare hands below, while his torpedo men prepared 3 more charges. Already down by the bow, the tanker could not defend herself from the relentless Americans, and by 4:21 a.m., 3 more torpedoes finished her and dragged her down. As Ramage looked for another target, the gunboat Kazan Maru appeared out of nowhere, racing straight towards his submarine, with clear intentions to ram. Inexplicably, Parche was at a standstill in the middle of the battle when her commander ordered, quote, all ahead flank. If it hadn't been for helmsman Chet Stanton, who gave the order to turn full right at the last moment, Parche would have been cut in half. Ramage gave the instruction a fraction of a second too late. Now clear of danger, Parche spotted her next victim, a 9,000-ton transport. The only problem was that the vessel was straight ahead, leaving a slim chance to shoot it directly at the bow. 2 of 3 torpedoes hit Yoshino Maru, and then Parche launched another from her stern. Then, as the skipper recalled, the transport, quote, suddenly disappeared from sight in one big blurb. At 4:47 a.m., the gyro aiming mechanism in the forward torpedo room jammed, forcing Parche to withdraw. Plus, dawn was about to break. The remarkable battle lasted just 34 minutes, during which the submarine fired 19 torpedoes, 9 of which had been impressively reloaded while on the surface and during relentless action. Parche was credited with 4 ships sunk, while Steelhead sank 2. The episode was eventually dubbed Ramage's Rampage, as it involved more shooting in less time than any other American submarine attack in the entire war. When Park's pirates returned to Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Submarine Force U.S. Pacific Fleet, nominated Ramage for the Medal of Honor. Only 2 submariners had been awarded the United States' highest military honor, both posthumously, making Ramage the first living recipient. Still, Ramage felt the medal was owed to every sailor in his crew, and after the ceremony, he created a certificate for every man under his command, arguing that, quote, every officer and man whose loyal cooperation and able assistance contributed to the success of the USS Parchi has an equal share in this award. In the early hours of October 25, 1944, during the Allied effort to retake the Philippines, the Americans made a crucial mistake. Deceived by a masterful Japanese feint, they were utterly unprepared to fight a major battle in the Pacific theater, a first for them. Unwittingly, the U.S. Third Fleet was drawn away from the Philippines into a wild goose chase, rendering the forces on Leyte Island completely unguarded. The Japanese ships to the east of Samar Island had a free run to wipe out the landing craft and troop transports, not merely crippling the operation, but possibly turning the tide of the war against the Allies. Now, only a modest anti-submarine task group stood between the Japanese fleet and the 200,000 American soldiers and Marines fighting on Leyte. The men of Taffy 3 grasped the gravity of the situation and were prepared to fight against overwhelming odds. Outgunned and outmatched, they knew that their mission was to hold the line and buy precious time for the reinforcements to arrive. U.S. Navy Task Group Taffy 3 was primarily assigned to provide ground attack aircraft to support the infantry inland. It consisted of a handful of ships, 6 carrier escorts, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The group was not at all designed for engaging enemy warships in direct combat. When Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, Taffy 3's commander, received a radio call from one of his reconnaissance pilots reporting that a large Japanese fleet was approaching, he couldn't help but be concerned. Bearing down on them was the Japanese super battleship Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed battleship in the history of naval warfare. Yamato was equipped with massive cannons to fire gigantic bullets with a range of over 15 miles. A single round would wreck any one of Sprague's vessels. The colossal warship alone dwarfed his entire fleet. Making matters worse, the behemoth battleship was accompanied by 3 more massive battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, all closing in fast. In stark contrast, the biggest guns in Taffy 3 were mid-sized crew-operated cannons, which were used against aircraft and other lightly armored targets like surfaced submarines. The sailors of Taffy 3 were significantly outgunned and outmatched, but they would never outrun the Japanese. As the Japanese cruisers closed in, the American destroyers quickly pumped black smoke to conceal the carriers from enemy gunners, who could effortlessly shred the unarmored carriers like paper. In a daring maneuver, USS Johnston suddenly emerged from the smoke. The 15,000-ton destroyer was commanded by Captain Ernest E. Evans, a Cherokee Indian who had vowed never to retreat from the Japanese. On the contrary, Johnston embarked on a one-ship sacrifice run straight into the teeth of the heavily armed Japanese fleet. Zigzagging through a barrage of concentrated fire from 23 enemy ships, Evans knew one hit would end his crew. Fortunately, he wasn't alone. 6 squadrons of American fighter bombers flew over the destroyer heading towards the Japanese fleet among a hail of tracer fire and airburst shrapnel, strafing the enemy ships with everything they had. Defying all odds, the courageous ship managed to close within range of the lead Japanese heavy cruiser, Kumano. Blasting all 5 of her guns at a hulking warship that outweighed her by a factor of 7, Johnston let rip 200 rounds of ammunition in just 5 minutes. Astonishingly, she destroyed gun mounts and launched a 10-torpedo salvo that ripped Kumano apart. Having expended all her torpedoes, Johnston turned about and headed back towards Taffy 3, still blasting hundreds of rounds at anything with a rising sun emblazoned on their hull. That is, until her luck ran out. At last, USS Johnston took a direct hit from Congo. The shot punched through her hull, destroying a boiler and cutting her speed in half. Additionally, a round from a heavy cruiser ignited a magazine of anti-aircraft ammunition, spewing shrapnel across several decks. Another round from another enemy ship then slammed directly into the ship's bridge, snapping the mast and destroying communications and radar capabilities. Captain Evans lost 2 fingers and suffered severe injuries from the shrapnel, but kept commanding the ship. Above the chaos, the Avengers and Hellcats continued their mission, diving at high speeds on the enemy and releasing their bomb loads. Remarkably, even the pilots whose bomb bays only contained propaganda leaflets found a way to contribute to the battle by making fake torpedo runs on the enemy cruisers. The gimmick threw the Japanese off their game and bought the American fleet more time to escape. Inspired by Johnston, the remaining destroyers, Herman, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts, threw themselves through the smokescreen into the arena. Among Tappy 3's ships, Roberts was especially tiny, slow, lightly armed, and nearly unarmored. Then, as the second puny attack wave reached torpedo range, they passed by the crippled Johnston, limping back towards the carriers. Captain Evans stood at attention on the deck, saluting the passing destroyers as they hurtled towards almost certain defeat. Gritting his teeth, Evans ordered his ship to turn around and rejoin the fray. As the rest of the American destroyers charged straight into the midst of the Japanese formation with blazing anti-aircraft and anti-submarine guns, the severely damaged Johnston provided cover fire from the rear with whatever ammunition was left in her 5-inch guns. Meanwhile, USS Hull launched her torpedoes at the battleship Congo with no luck, and then turned her attention to trading salvos with the Imperial cruiser Haguro. Herman then struck 4 Japanese battleships with a barrage of 54-pound shells from her 5-inch guns, and then turned to the crown jewel of the Imperial Navy. Firing torpedoes at Yamato, Herman forced the battleship to peel off, while the petite Roberts joined in, hammering the heavy cruiser Chokai with torpedoes and gunfire at point-blank range. However, Captain Evans soon noticed something distressing. A group of 5 Japanese destroyers was preparing to attack the American carriers, and his ship was the only one with any hope of stopping them. Without hesitation, Evans directed Johnston forward, diving straight into the formation. Outnumbered 5-1, and by better-equipped enemies, the captain pressed on, firing frantically. Against all odds, he managed to throw the entire Japanese column off course, distracting their aim and sending the enemy torpedoes wide of their target. In the midst of the intense gun battle, the destroyer escorts Dennis, Raymond, and John C. Butler joined their sister ship Roberts and fired with everything they had to keep the Japanese vessels away from the carriers. While Herman traded fire with 2 heavy cruisers at point-blank range, Hull fought for her life against 3 warships, and Roberts fired at a rate that would see her expend 600 rounds in just an hour, although she succeeded in knocking out the heavy cruiser Chokai. Remarkably, the tiny American fleet was not merely surviving the battle, but actually winning. For the next hour, the fighting was fast and unrelenting, but the situation quickly spiraled downwards. Remarkably, Herman and the destroyer escorts damaged the cruiser Chikuma, which fled but was promptly torpedoed into a coral reef by Avenger aircraft. Things slowly started to turn against the American fleet. For one, Herman took a round to the bridge. Ablaze, she continued to fight, despite being boxed in by a trio of enemy destroyers. Hull was also swarmed by battleships and cruisers, and finally hit by Congo. 3 heavy 14-inch shells smashed her aft engine and guns, rendering her navigation system inoperable. However, Hull still went on. She aimed manually because her electronics were broken, and shot her last torpedoes at the cruiser Haguro. The salvo struck true and detonated the cruiser's lower decks, forcing her out of action. However, Hull was now in deep trouble. With most of her weapons either depleted of ammunition or broken beyond repair and unable to evade her attackers, Hull was struck 40 times during the 1-hour battle and smashed to bits. The captain orders his crew to abandon ship, but the gun crews refused, staying back to continue firing even as the ship sank beneath them. They were only silenced after an enemy round detonated their ammunition stores. Subsequently, Roberts was also hit. A 3-round salvo of massive armor-piercing shells forced her to call for the crew to abandon ship, bringing an abrupt end to a heroic struggle. Back on the carrier, Gambier Bay became the only U.S. carrier ever sunk by surface fire after taking a stray round from a Japanese battleship. Despite being struck 15 times by enemy shells, Kalinin Bay kept floating. But aside from those 2 setbacks, the rest of the escort carriers continued their desperate dash to safety, thanks to the brave destroyer escorts who sacrificed themselves to save the day. The escort carriers deftly avoided a second enemy torpedo run, helped by some heroic sharpshooting pilots shooting machine gun fire while hauling at 200 miles per hour. Elsewhere, USS Johnston was valiantly fighting her last stand, firing in every direction while surrounded by 4 destroyers, hammering her superstructure without mercy. With her guns knocked out and her engines flooded, Evans gave the order to abandon ship, and Johnston was never seen again. As the Japanese destroyers sailed off to rejoin the rest of the battle, their crew members came on deck and saluted the American sailors floating in the water. In a 2.5-hour melee, the Americans lost 4 ships, the destroyers Johnston and Hull, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts and the escort carrier Gambier Bay. The Japanese, who had gone into the battle with an unimaginably more powerful force, suffered similar losses. 2 heavy cruisers, Chokai and Chikuma, 2 more severely damaged, Kumano and Suzuya, and the battleship Harima sustained severe damage. Realizing that the losses he was taking were not worth the cost, and seeing that fresh reinforcements were rapidly approaching, Admiral Takeo Kurita called off the attack. Taffy 3 had somehow held off the largest gunship fleet ever assembled, and the group had done it with just 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers. Ultimately, Taffy 3 lost 792 men, and another 768 were wounded. But despite the odds, they accomplished their mission. The carriers and the Leyte landing craft were safe. Moreover, the Japanese center force had been repulsed in one of the most heroic naval battles ever fought. The entire unit received the Presidential Unit Citation, and Captain Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Throughout the Battle of Samar, Admiral Kurita had believed he was fighting fleet carriers, escorted by American heavy cruisers. He had no idea he was fighting units half that size. The Buckley-class destroyer escorts were smaller and cheaper alternatives to standard U.S. Navy destroyers. However, they were outstanding vessels when it came to anti-submarine warfare and escort duties, and USS England was one of them. Armed with the powerful British-designed 24-barrel Hedgehog motor, England was equipped with all the essential features that made her an excellent submarine hunter, despite her size and armament compared to larger battleships. In a remarkable and historic run, the tiny warship would excel at sinking enemy submarines in waters infested by Japanese vessels during a short but fruitful hunting season. And her record remains unbroken almost 80 years later. USS England was launched in September of 1943 at the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation shipyard in San Francisco, sponsored by Mrs. H.B. England, the mother of Ensign John C. England, who lost his life aboard the battleship USS Oklahoma during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She was commissioned on December 10, 1943, and sent to the Pacific after going over basic sea trials. Buckley-class destroyer escorts were designed for anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort, and were powered by 2 Foster Wheeler Express D water tube boilers, 2 GE steam turbines of 13,500 horsepower, and 2 generators with 12,000 horsepower. Their maximum speed was 24 knots, and their estimated range was 5,500 miles at 15 knots. Plus, the class had a capacity for over 350 tons of oil. Fully loaded, a Buckley-class destroyer escort could displace a weight of 1,740 tons and had a length of 306 feet, a beam of 36 feet, and a draft of 11 feet. USS England was armed with 3 3-inch guns, 1 triple bank of 21-inch torpedoes, 8 side-throwing K-gun depth-charge projectors, 1 Mark 10 Hedgehog anti-submarine motor, and 2 stern depth-charge racks. The British-designed 24-barrel Hedgehog motor fired an elliptical spread of 24 ASW projectiles up to 300 yards ahead of the ship. Samuel J. Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, said that, quote, "The projectiles would fire in a sequence, so they would all impact the water at the same time. Unlike standard depth charges, which had hydrostatic fuses, each Hedgehog projectile had a contact fuse that detonated on impact with the submarine." Cox notes that this system had several advantages. First, it was immediately evident if the attack had been successful. If the projectiles made contact, there had to be an explosion. In addition, enemy submarines could not detect the Hedgehog until it was too late to maneuver, and she could be reloaded in 3 minutes. England arrived at Espiritu Santo in Samna Province, Vanuatu, on March 12, 1944, from a long voyage in which she traversed Pearl Harbor, Funafuti, and the captured island of Guadalcanal. During the month of April, she conducted escort missions between the 3 locations and the Marshall Islands. The crew was eager for action, as the escort duties had been uneventful. No Japanese vessel or submarine was sighted during the operations. Finally, on May 13, 1944, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted and decoded a message from the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-16. I-16 had sent a final radio transmission before departing Truk without realizing her doom was near. The message contained details about a rice delivery for Imperial Army troops stationed at Buin on Bougainville Island, and the expected arrival at the Solomon Islands was May 22nd after 10 p.m. Commander Hamilton Haynes, the head of Escort Division 39 based at Tulagi, immediately ordered a 3-ship hunter-killer task force to get rid of the submarine before it arrived at its destination. The epic hunting saga of USS England began on May 18th, when Escort Division 39, comprising USS Robbie and USS George, was dispatched alongside USS England from Escort Division 40 to intercept the hostile submarine. England was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, and the 3 destroyer escorts departed Purvis Bay on May 18, 1944, with Commander Haynes aboard USS George as an officer in tactical command. Later that day, the task force learned that the Japanese had established a line of 7 submarines between New Guinea and the Central Pacific Caroline Islands to draw American forces in and destroy them in one decisive battle. The strategy was part of Operation Ago. Most of the orders and specific positions radioed by the Japanese Sixth Fleet were intercepted by the U.S. Navy and shared with the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area Estimates Section. Meanwhile, USS England and the 2 escort destroyers were hunting their prey. On May 19th, Allied aircraft sighted I-16 surfacing north of Bougainville, and at 1:35 p.m., the escorts detected the submarine with a sonar sweep. England then went into action and launched 2 Hedgehog attacks. I-16 evaded them, but a third one hit. Even so, the seasoned Japanese crew kept conducting evasive maneuvers, and a 4th Hedgehog failed to hit the target. Finally, the submarine's luck ran out during the 5th run. 5 solid hits led to a massive underwater explosion at around 2:35 p.m. In a 1980 article from Proceedings magazine, Captain John Williamson, England's executive officer, recalled, quote, "England's fantail was lifted a full 6 inches, then plopped heavily back into the water. We had, with cataclysmic certainty, heard the last of one Japanese submarine. Sobered and more than taken aback by that final blast, we no longer felt like cheering. But we did stand a little straighter." Half an hour later, debris began surfacing from the ocean. I-16 was lost with all her crew, but there was no time to celebrate. The 7 submarines from Operation Ago had departed Saipan, and there was work to do. During the night of May 22nd, the 3 escort destroyers detected submarine RO-106 when it surfaced. USS George spotted the enemy vessel on the surface and illuminated her with her searchlight. RO-106 had problems with her radar and was caught off guard. The submarine immediately went into a dive and tried to escape, but England and Robbie immediately launched Hedgehogs, missing every time. The 3 U.S. Navy ships hunted down the enemy submarine for over 20 minutes before she was picked up by the radar once again. This time, the Japanese tried to counterattack and turned directly in England's direction to launch her torpedoes. Nevertheless, USS England was faster and scored 3 hits before the enemy was within range. RO-106 then went to the depths with all 49 hands. On May 23rd, RO-104 became England's 3rd prey. The submarine was at her assigned station when she was sighted about 250 nautical miles north-northwest of Cavieng in New Ireland. USS Robbie gained radar contact at around 6 a.m., and so did RO-104, which quickly vanished into the sea. A cat-and-mouse chase followed, with the 3 Buckleys conducting Hedgehog attacks to sink the Japanese submarine. Even so, RO-104 maneuvered efficiently, avoiding more than 5 attacks and jamming the sonars of the ships with tuned sound impulses. 2 hours later, the hunt ended when England hit the target with 12 projectiles from her 2nd Hedgehog attack. A colossal underwater explosion followed, signaling that RO-104 and her crew of 58 were gone. USS England was on a streak, and there was still much more to come. Soon after sinking another submarine, RO-116, on May 24th, the trio of Buckley escort destroyers sailed at full speed towards Seidler Harbor in Manus Island, where Ruby gained radar contact on RO-108, commanded by Lieutenant Kenichi Obari. The submarine was on her 5th patrol and had a crew with plenty of naval experience. Like her sisters, RO-108 submerged and began evasive maneuvers to escape from the ships after spotting them. USS Robbie almost scored a direct hit, but England quickly followed with an accurate Hedgehog launch and scored 6 projectiles on the enemy submarine. The underwater explosion and the debris that surfaced minutes later signaled that USS England had sunk her 4th Japanese submarine, this time with 53 crewmen on board. However, the task force quickly returned to the hunting grounds of the Pacific on May 30th, 1944. The 3 Buckleys joined a larger task force of former destroyers, and during the night of May 31st, gained radar contact on RO-105. The hunting continued well into the early morning. RO-105 used every imaginable trick to run away, but she was cornered by a superior force. Several destroyers attempted to strike her down, but kept failing. Then, when it was finally England's turn, her crew was ready to keep the streak going. At one point during the hunt, Commander Haynes said, quote, "Oh hell, go ahead, England," and she did. Minutes later, RO-105 was lost with all her crew. USS England would earn 10 battle stars for her service in the Pacific before being attacked by Japanese aircraft in Okinawa in May of 1945. Over 37 crewmen were lost, and the ship was severely damaged. She was then scrapped in 1946 after the war ended. Even so, USS England still keeps the record for most submarines sunk by a single ship to this very day, and her 6 submarine streak over 12 days remains unparalleled. In the darkest time of the Pacific Theater, amidst the deafening roars of gunfire, the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco reeled under an endless torrent of Japanese shells. Among smoke-filled chaos, Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless found himself at a crossroads. Only moments before, the bridge had been the heart of the New Orleans-class cruiser. Now, it was but a tomb. His fellow officers, the men he had stood shoulder to shoulder with for almost a year, leading their ship onto many victories, now lay motionless, swallowed by a fate that narrowly missed him. Pushing the rising panic away, the communications officer jumped to his feet. There was no time to grieve, not while his ship, a 10,000-ton giant armed with 27 guns, was steering blind and losing men by the minute. With an uneven breath but a rush of adrenaline running inside him, Lieutenant Commander McCandless seized the helm of USS San Francisco, one of the most legendary ships of World War II. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Ed Ifkin, an off-duty signalman, was casually lounging on the signal bridge of USS San Francisco, engrossed in his newspaper, when an aircraft with a bold red insignia buzzed above his head. San Francisco, a formidable New Orleans-class cruiser, initially launched in 1933, was anchored in Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, awaiting an overhaul scheduled to be completed by Christmas Day. But the tranquility of the early morning was shattered as Japanese planes descended with their fury. Trained to recognize foreign emblems, Ifkin identified the intruding aircraft. He later recalled, quote, "I telephoned down to the bridge and told the duty officer. He responded, 'Ifkin, you'll go on report for fooling around,' when, boom, the first torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma." Ifkin's prompt action earned him the distinction of being the first United States sailor to report the infamous Pearl Harbor attack. By 8 a.m., the initial clash between the Japanese and the Americans was in full swing. The crew of San Francisco quickly prepared their cruiser for watertight conditions and then immediately began looking for opportunities to fight back. However, the ship's engineering plant was disassembled for the overhaul. Moreover, of her 27 guns, only small arms and 2 .30-caliber machine guns were operational for this unexpected onslaught. Undeterred, Ifkin and several other officers and men from San Francisco's crew complement of 101 officers and 803 enlisted jumped over to their sister ship, New Orleans. For the next 2 hours, they endlessly fed ammunition to the guns. When the Japanese finally retreated, Pearl Harbor was in ruins, but remarkably, San Francisco emerged unscathed. Work promptly resumed to transform her from a peacetime vessel into a combat-ready warship, prepared to face the trials of the war that had just begun. In February 1942, Captain Casson Young was chosen to command the heavy cruiser. A seasoned commander and great leader, Young had been part of the Navy since 1916 and was already a Medal of Honor recipient for his service in Pearl Harbor, where he swam through burning oil to save his ship. As a key member of Task Force 16, the heavy cruiser served in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942, the first American air operation to strike the Japanese archipelago. Here, the ship cast a protective shadow over the aircraft carriers, launching a surprise bombing raid. While it inflicted minimal damage, the Doolittle raid showed Japan that America was unflinching, prepared to retaliate, and ready to assault the mainland if necessary. In May, San Francisco charted a course toward the South Pacific, heading into a hotbed of conflict. By August, she was deeply embroiled in the Solomon Islands campaign, supporting the crucial landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. There, in the intense Battle of Guadalcanal, which spanned from August 1942 to February 1943, the ship began forging her legendary reputation. During these early stages, she played a vital role in safeguarding United States forces on the island and disrupting Japanese supply lines. On October 31, 1942, now part of the newly formed Task Force 65, Frisco, as her valiant crew knew her, journeyed into the heart of the Solomon Islands. The following month saw the heavy cruiser engaged in convoy escort work and shore bombardment duties, while flying the flag of her former commanding officer, now Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. On November 8th, she set her sights on Guadalcanal, answering the island's beckoning call, ready to dive back into the war. This time, however, Young, Callahan, and all their men were heading into the iconic naval battle of Guadalcanal, the decisive engagement between the Allies and Imperial Japan, and one of the most intense and pivotal battles of the entire campaign. On the twilight of November 13, 1942, USS San Francisco braced for a confrontation with a superior Japanese fleet in an area between Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands. The enemy force consisted of 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, a light cruiser, and a swarm of 11 destroyers. Just before 2 a.m., Rear Admiral Callahan rallied his men, steeling them for the imminent close-quarters nocturnal clash. In the pitch black, at ranges of less than 1,000 yards, both forces unleashed their fury. Amidst the onslaught, the chaos led some American ships to inadvertently fire upon each other, the dark rendering friend from foe indistinguishable. The combat erupted into a brutal and fierce free-for-all. In the thick of the fight, USS San Francisco and her crew were caught in the crossfire, becoming the target of a battleship, a cruiser, and a destroyer, absorbing as many as 45 direct hits. Despite this, they landed a critical hit on the Japanese battleship Hiei, incapacitating her steering compartment. This crippling damage left the ship exposed at dawn, leading to a bombardment by U.S. aircraft and her subsequent scuttling by her own crew, marking the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II. However, the toll on San Francisco was equally catastrophic. A lethal salvo took the lives of dozens of men, including Rear Admiral Callahan, Captain Cassin Young, and all the officers on San Francisco's bridge. All except for Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless. Effectively left leaderless amidst the chaos of battle, 31-year-old Lieutenant Commander McCandless, the ship's communication officer, swiftly assumed command. Taking the helm, he conned the vessel for the remainder of the battle. Despite the damage inflicted upon the ship and the loss of key personnel, McCandless expertly maneuvered the battered cruiser out of the enemy's line of fire, all the while ensuring the ship's guns continued their fiery retaliation. At 4 a.m., the ship was again under control, and the heavily damaged cruiser retreated through the Sealark Channel. The crew's resilience, led by an unlikely interim captain, ensured USS San Francisco lived to fight another day. In this unforgiving melee, 106 brave sailors were lost, and another 131 were wounded in what U.S. Navy Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King once labeled the most ferocious sea battle in history. For her actions at Cape Esperance and the naval battle of Guadalcanal, San Francisco earned a Presidential Unit citation. Furthermore, 4 members of her crew, including Admiral Callahan, received the Congressional Medal of Honor. An astounding 31 Navy Crosses and 21 Silver Stars were also awarded. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless received the Medal of Honor and a promotion to full commander for his remarkable conduct. After the intense Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, the battle-damaged USS San Francisco required urgent repair. She sailed to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California for an extensive restoration, preparing to re-enter combat on a markedly different front. Reinstated to active service in May 1943, San Francisco set sail to Alaska's Aleutian Islands, where she contributed to the liberation of Attu and Kiska, in what some historians call the American theater of World War II. By November, the formidable cruiser voyaged back to the Pacific, becoming part of the offensive on Makin in the Gilbert Islands. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, her anti-aircraft guns blazed, safeguarding American aircraft carriers from a storm of Japanese aircraft. In July, she lent support to the combat on Guam before returning to her namesake city for an overhaul. Rejoining the fleet in November, she was redeployed to the Philippines for anti-submarine operations and sea-air rescue duties. When the fleet found itself in the grip of a typhoon that claimed 3 destroyers, the cruiser showed her softer side, taking part in the ensuing rescue mission. As 1945 dawned, Japan's power waned, and yet the mission of San Francisco and her crew was far from over. In February, she was a part of the invasion force that attacked Iwo Jima, one of the Pacific War's fiercest battles. 2 months later, she partook in the final offensive of the Pacific Campaign, the invasion of Okinawa, displaying the same unwavering resolve that had become her hallmark. Following Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, she undertook occupation duties, staying in Japanese waters until her final return to her home city in November. By World War II's end, USS San Francisco had earned an astounding tally of 17 battle stars and a Presidential Unit citation, making her one of the most decorated U.S. warships of the conflict, surpassed only by USS Enterprise. Like many commendable ships of the era, the San Francisco was sold for scrap in 1959. Yet a part of the San Francisco endures. After the naval battle of Guadalcanal, some of the remnants of the damaged bridge were procured by the city of San Francisco and assembled into a memorial, a lasting tribute to the now legendary cruiser.